survived. We were the true stewards of the land. So, and after that came the colonialism, and this is what we're going to be learning about now. So, anyway, I hope everybody is will learn something today. So, without further, I think they're ready to start. Thank you.
Members of the congregation and community, members of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and members of the Ho-Chunk United Church of Christ, welcome to the blanket exercise. It is not the purpose or intention of the blanket exercise to make non-Native people feel badly about themselves. However, some of what you hear today may be upsetting and make you feel uncomfortable. What we do not want is for anyone to be in real emotional distress. Discomfort is okay. Distress is not okay. We have comforters available if you are feeling particularly upset. Naomi and Ron.
Just Ron.
Just Ron. Ron Welch is available if you have any questions or are particularly upset. They will move around the blankets and they may check in with you throughout the exercise to make sure you are doing okay. You may also ask them to sit and to talk with you if you were experiencing some distress. If you were concerned about standing for more than an hour, take a chair to sit on with you when the exercise begins and you are asked to step into the blankets. A series of PowerPoint slides will follow along with the narrators and historians' oral presentations and will provide additional information on the topics being discussed. An electronic copy of the PowerPoint will be sent to you if we have your email address. The PowerPoint includes additional online resources and suggested reading material. A personal pledge document will be made available to you after the exercise, along with a very short questionnaire about your experience today. Your primary tasks are to listen to the instructions given you by the narrator and to keep your feet on the blankets as best you can. If you are asked by the narrator to please step off the blanket, you may sit down for the remainder of the exercise. We will take a 15-minute break after the exercise and move to small groups at various locations throughout the church for the talking circles. Indigenous facilitators will lead you through that activity. When you are finished, you will return to the fellowship hall for the closing. If there are no questions, we will begin. The blanket exercise is an opportunity to learn our shared history and to form a common memory.
Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created. We have one planet, one human family living on it. We must start acting as such.
You are about to participate in an interactive exercise designed to deepen your understanding of the denial of the Indigenous people's humanity in the United States. You will learn how Indigenous peoples lost access to their land and what impact this loss had on their communities, both in the past and today. This exercise will also show us how Indigenous peoples have always resisted assimilation and acculturation.
For many Indigenous peoples, Turtle Island refers to the continent of North America. The story of Turtle Island varies among Indigenous communities, but by most accounts it acts as a creation story that places emphasis on a turtle as a symbol of life in Earth. Turtle is said to support the world as an icon of life itself. Turtle Island therefore speaks to various spiritual beliefs about creation, and for some the turtle is a mark for identity, culture, autonomy, and a deeply held respect for the environment.
Please remove your shoes and step onto the blankets. feel free to move around and interact with one another. These blankets represent the land of the original inhabitants of the northern part of Terra Nullius, or North America, before the arrival of the Europeans. You represent the indigenous peoples, the original inhabitants. Long before the arrival of the Europeans, the island was home to millions of people living in thousands of distinct, self-governing societies that formed hundreds of nations. These were fishing, hunting, and farming societies with their own languages, cultures, and traditions. These nations had their own laws and ways of governing themselves. As nations, you worked with one another. You traded and shared gifts through networks of trails and water routes that covered thousands of miles. You learned to resolve clashes and disputes over lands and resources through conflict resolution.
The Menomonie, Chippewa, Potawatomi, and Ho-Chunk peoples are among the original inhabitants of Wisconsin. However, many indigenous groups of North America, such as the Dakota, Odawa, Fox, Meskwaki, Sauk, and Oneida, have all called Wisconsin their home at some point in the last 3 centuries.
Diverse as you were, as indigenous peoples, you shared things in common. Your relationship to the land defined you who you were as peoples. All your needs, food, clothing, shelter, culture, spiritual fulfillment, were met by the land and waters, represented here by the blankets. In turn, you took very seriously your collective responsibility to serve and protect the land. Then, events occurred in Europe at the end of the 15th century that would deeply impact your societies. In 1493, the King and Queen of Spain asked Pope Alexander VI to issue the following papal bull, a solemn declaration from the Vatican. Known as the Doctrine of Discovery, it established Christian dominion and subjugation over pagan non-Christians. Spain was granted the right to conquer any lands its explorers discovered. Non-Christian nations could no longer own the lands, and the indigenous people were placed under the guardianship of those Christian nations that discovered their lands. They were to be taught the right way to believe and live, by force if necessary.
The majority of the non-European world was colonized under an international legal principle that is known today as the Doctrine of Discovery. The doctrine provided that Europeans automatically acquired property rights in native lands and gained governmental, political, and commercial rights over the indigenous inhabitants without their knowledge or consent. This legal principle was created and justified by religious, racial, and ethnocentric ideas of European and Christian superiority over other peoples and religions.
We, by the authority of Almighty God, give, grant, and assign to you and your heirs and successors, kings of Castile and Leon, forever all islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered, towards the west and south, from the Arctic people to the Antarctic people. And we make, appoint, and depute you and your said heirs and successors, lords of them with full and free power, authority, and jurisdiction of every kind.
The doctrine of discovery is still international and domestic law today, and is being actively applied against indigenous peoples and nations. The most recent U.S. Supreme Court case citing the doctrine of discovery occurred in 2005 in City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation. In 2007 and 2010, Russia and China evoked the doctrine by planting their flags on the seabeds of the Arctic Ocean and the South China Sea to claim commercial and sovereign rights. The doctrine has also been featured prominently in the international news in recent years, as indigenous activists and some churches have worked to repudiate it.
The notion of Terra Nullius as used in the Doctrine of Discovery, means empty land. If the land was deemed empty by the settler government, it was considered subject to the Doctrine of Discovery and could be claimed by the European explorers. Over time, this concept was conveniently expanded to include lands not occupied by civilized peoples, or lands not being put to civilized use.
Many Americans grew up learning that this continent was discovered by Christopher Columbus. The concept of discovery is that the land was empty prior to arrival and its indigenous inhabitants were somehow less than the explorers is, at its heart, racism and cultural superiority.
Thus began the process of European discovery and colonization of the Turtle Island that started in the east and moved across the continent.
(1492 to 1787), an era of tribal independence, about 295 years. Between 1492 and 1787, Indigenous peoples experienced a period of tribal independence in their relationships with Europeans. Peaceful relations existed when it suited the interests of Europeans, although violence between Indians and settlers increased over time. Diseases introduced by Europeans decimated Indian populations, while the European population increased at a great rate. After the Revolutionary War, Americans began their quest for more land, and a pattern of invading and taking possession of Indian territory began.
In contact with Europeans, each of the hundreds of indigenous nations of North America possessed all the elements of nationhood that were well established by European settlers: territory, governing structures, and legal systems. There is even historical evidence that the governing structure of the Iroquois Confederacy had a degree of influence on the drafting of the U.S. Constitution.
When Europeans first arrived on Turtle Island, they were greatly outnumbered by you, the indigenous peoples, and they depended on you for their survival. They needed you to help them make sense of the complex political and social systems that already existed. Your early relationships with the settlers were based on cooperation and interdependence. You married each other. The settlers and their governors recognized you as distinct peoples with self-governing societies. This led to nation-to-nation relationships which were formalized in treaties, including some trade arrangements and military alliances.
The Royal Proclamation of 1763 hereby confirms that indigenous nations have title to their lands, and that consensual treaty making with the Crown is the only way that land can be ceded from indigenous people.
Thus, the relationship between indigenous nations and Europeans became defined by agreements or treaties between equals. Indigenous nations were still strong militarily and still a threat. Laws were passed to protect against the taking of Indian land, but few were actively enforced, and European expansion was encouraged. But signs of resistance began to occur between indigenous peoples and the British toward the end of the tribal independence era and the treaty-making era.
In the 1760s, Pontiac of the Ottawas united tribes in the Great Lakes country in hopes of driving the British back across the Alleghenies. The siege of Fort Pitt was a part of Pontiac's war, an effort by Native Americans to remove the British from the Ohio country and the Allegheny Plateau after they refused to honor their promises and treaties to leave voluntarily after the defeat of the French. The Native American efforts of diplomacy to remove the British from Fort Pitt ultimately failed. The Indians attacked Fort Pitt at Detroit. They burned nearby houses, forcing the inhabitants to take refuge in the well-protected fort. The British officer in charge, Captain Simeon Écuyer, reported to Colonel Henry Bouquet in Philadelphia that he feared the crowded conditions would result in disease. Smallpox had already broken out. On June 24th, 1763, William Trent, a local trader, recorded in his journal that 2 Indian chiefs had visited the fort, urging the British to abandon the fight, but the British refused. Instead, when the Indians were ready to leave, Trent wrote, "Out of our regard for them, we gave them 2 blankets and an handkerchief out of the smallpox hospital. I hope it will have the desired effect." The outbreak devastated the Indians.
Under the advice of Field Marshal Lord Jeffrey Amherst, Commander-in-Chief of Forces, quote, "You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race." Unquote.
For Europeans, land was a commodity that could be bought and sold, and treaties were a means of getting you, the indigenous peoples, to surrender or extinguish your title to the land.
1787 to 1828, the Agreement Treaty era, a period of 41 years. Later, the United States federal government replaced the Crown as the treaty-making body, and between 1787 and 1828, the strategy of treaty-making became the policy of the United States, supported by Article 1, Section 8 in the American Constitution. To indigenous peoples, treaties were sacred agreements that were marked with spiritual ceremonies. They were not statements of submission or surrender, or real estate deals. Instead, they were statements of peace, friendship, and alliance that were based on instructions of traditional indigenous spirituality around sharing, respect, and honesty. Treaties were a way of sharing land and resources and of ensuring peaceful coexistence among diverse peoples. According to the U.S. National Archives, 374 treaties signed between the United States and indigenous nations from 1772 to 1867 were ratified. The land of the lower 48 contiguous states is approximately 1.9 billion acres. During the agreement and treaty era, the United States seized over 1.5 billion acres from the indigenous peoples by treaty and executive order.
More pockets of resistance arose. Born in 1768 in present-day Ohio, Tecumseh of the Shawnees lived during an era of near-constant conflict between the Shawnee tribe and the white frontiersmen. Tecumseh formed a great confederacy of Midwestern and Southern tribes, including the Seneca, Wyandot, Sac, Fox, Winnebago, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Delaware, and Miami to protect their lands from invasion.
Where today are the Pequot? Chief Tecumseh asked. Where are the Narragansett, the Mohican, Pakanoke, and many other once powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice of the oppression of the white man. As snow before a summer sun, we will let ourselves be destroyed in our turn without a struggle. Give up our homes, our country bequeathed to us by the Great Spirit, the graves of our dead, and everything that is dear and sacred to us. I know you will cry with me. Never, never.
The dream ended with Tecumseh's death in battle during the War of 1812. The Miamis fought battle after battle, and signed treaty after treaty, ceding their rich Ohio lands until there were none left to cede.
With the end of the War of 1812, the newcomers in the East no longer needed you as military allies. In the West, as the fur trade dried up and colonists were turned more and more to agriculture, they no longer needed you as trading partners either. Soon the Europeans began to outnumber you. One reason for this was the diseases the Europeans brought with them. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and TB, for which you had no immunity. Some experts believe fully half of the indigenous people alive at the time died from these diseases. Many communities were decimated and lost up to 90% of their members. All people with a white index card, please step off the blanket. You represent the millions of indigenous peoples who died of the various diseases to which you had no immunity. We will take a minute of silence to remember those who died. More Europeans also meant an ever-increasing demand for land for settlement. Indigenous nations were viewed as obstacles to the expansion and settlement and as a problem to be solved. The government adopted policies and practices to take your land. Some were taken in war, a lot more since it was taken without any right or justification, was stolen by the government. Some was taken by force, which led some of you to being killed. Without access to the land, you could no longer practice your traditional lifestyles. Many of you lost your cultures and languages. Some of you lost all hope and a reason to live. You represent the original inhabitants of what is now New England and the mid-Atlantic coast. Your people, the ones who didn't starve or die in violent encounters with settlers trying to take their lands, were hunted and killed or taken captive for reward. Your people are now extinct. Nothing remains of your culture and your language is lost forever. Please step off the mic. (1828 to 1887), relocation and removal of Indians, a period of 59 years. Between 1828 and 1887, relocation and removal of the remaining eastern indigenous nations to the west became the dominant U.S. policy. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to treaties that forced most eastern Indian tribes to the west, as manifest destiny became the national rallying cry. In 1845, John L. O'Sullivan, a popular editor and columnist, declared America's manifest destiny to justify the annexation of Texas and the Oregon country. According to O'Sullivan,
the American claim is by the right to our manifest destiny to overspread and possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and self-government entrusted to us. John L. Sullivan, 1845.
From 1830 to 1840, the United States Army removed 60,000 indigenous peoples, Choctaw, Creek, Cherokee, and others, from the east in exchange for the new territory west of the Mississippi. Of the 15,000 Creeks who made the voyage to Oklahoma, more than 3,500 don't survive. More than 5,000 Cherokee died on a 1,200-mile march to Oklahoma. The series of relocations of indigenous nations and their hardships and deaths during the journey would become known as the Trail of Tears.
You represent the Choctaw, Creek, the Cherokee, and countless other indigenous communities who suffered and sometimes died for forced relocation. Please move one of the blankets away from the others, fold it small, and sit down on it. Whoever has a blue index card, please step off the blanket. You represent those who died of malnutrition after being forced off your traditional territories and away from your hunting grounds. In the prairies, an influx of settlers and the transfer of large tracts of land from the Indian Removal Act of 1830 met with significant resistance from you. In the end, you are defeated by the government's soldiers. You represent those leaders of the resistance who died in battle, were put in jail, or were executed. Please step off the line.
It was during the relocation and removal era that the first indigenous students attended the country's first off-reservation boarding school in 1879. By 1887, 200 boarding schools were established with 14,000 indigenous students forcibly enrolled. This was done pursuant to a federal policy designed to civilize Indians and to stamp out native cultures, a deliberate policy of ethnocide and cultural genocide.
Cut off from their families and culture, the children were punished for speaking their native languages. Banned from conducting traditional or cultural practices, shorn of traditional clothing and identity of their native cultures, taught that their cultures and traditions were evil and sinful, and that they should be ashamed of being Native American. Placed often far from home, they were frequently neglected or abused physically, sexually, and psychologically. Generations of these children became the legacy of the federal boarding school policy. They returned to their communities not as the Christianized farmers that the boarding school policy envisioned, but as deeply scarred humans lacking the skills, community, parenting, and extended family, language, and cultural practices of those raised in their cultural context.
Systematic institutional neglect and the fear of death from persistent mortalities motivated many students to run away. At Carlisle Indian School in the years from 1883 through 1918, there were 1,842 desertions and nearly 500 deaths, ranging between 3.5 and 4.5 times the national average at that time. Capture after running away, the only desperate act within the power of the children and teens, was punished by physical restraints, beatings, and isolation in unlighted cellars and unlighted and unventilated outbuildings designed as jails.
Unaccounted for, thousands of children died from disease, malnutrition, loneliness, and abuse. Survivors reported that many of the dead were buried anonymously, some in mass graves on the grounds of the residential schools. The remains of these children have never been returned to their families or communities.
There are children in the meadows and wetlands.
Native children ran there to hide.
When teachers pulled and butchered their hair.
When teachers stole their medicine bags.
When teachers collected their moccasins.
When teachers dressed them in strange clothes.
When teachers beat them with boards and belts.
When teachers starved them for being bad Indians.
The children ran to the meadows and wetlands.
There are children in the meadows and wetlands.
Hostages who were taken to Haskell.
Who never saw their families again.
Who never saw 9 or 11 or tomorrow.
Who didn't make it home for summer vacations.
Who couldn't stop whooping and coughing.
Who couldn't learn English fast enough.
Who wouldn't fall to their knees often enough.
They ran till they fell in the meadows and wetlands.
There are children in the meadows and wetlands.
Hostages were taken to a Chiloko.
Where they ran from teachers' fists and boots.
Where they ran from bounty hunters' cages.
Where they ran from high collars and hard shoes.
Where they ran from live soap in their mouths.
Where they ran from day and night.
Where they ran until wolves outran them.
Their teeth are in the meadows and wetlands.
There are children in the meadows and wetlands.
Hostages who were taken to Carlisle.
Who got to build the school buildings.
Who got Christian burials without coffins.
Who got a mass grave with their friends.
Who got plowed under for a football field.
Who got embedded in concrete for the stadium.
Who got to be the practice site for the Washington Redskins.
Because they ran to the wet meadows and wetlands.
There are children in the meadows and wetlands.
Native children ran there to hide.
You can see their clothes in museums.
You can see their pipe bags at the opera.
You can see bands marching on their hallowed ground.
You can see mascots dancing over their dead bodies.
You can imagine their hair long and beautiful again.
Safe from the teachers and the scissors at last.
These children in the meadows and wetlands.
All people with yellow index cards must now move in a group to a separate, empty blanket. You represent those who were taken out of your communities and placed in residential schools far from home. The person with the yellow index card that is marked with an X must step off the blanket. You represent those who died as a result of their experience at residential schools. All others with yellow cards, you may now return to your home communities, though you will always struggle to feel at home with your own people. Those of you without index cards, please turn your backs on your returning children to symbolize the rejection and alienation that you feel toward them. Returning children, please turn your backs to your people to symbolize the rejection and alienation that you feel from them.
By the end of the late 19th century, the United States government had authorized over 1,500 wars, attacks, and raids on indigenous people, the most of any country in the world against its indigenous people. Of the estimated 5 million to 15 million living in North America when Columbus arrived in 1492, fewer than 238,000 indigenous people remain. In 1871, Congress passed a law that stopped additional treaties with indigenous nations who were no longer seen as independent nations.
In 1880, Congress set up civilization regulations, a series of offenses that only Indians could commit. These regulations outlawed Indian villages, the practices of so-called medicine men, ceremonies like the sun dance, and leaving the reservation without permission. Indians could be imprisoned or have food surety rations withheld for up to 30 days for participating in Indian dances and feasts. Any medicine man convicted of encouraging others to follow these traditional practices was confined in an agency prison for not less than 10 days, or until he could provide evidence that he had abandoned his beliefs. These regulations were in place until 1936.
1887 to 1934, allotment and assimilation era, a period of 47 years. Between 1887 through 1932, allotment of indigenous lands and assimilation into white society became the new federal policy. The General Allotment Act of 1887, also known as the Dawes Act, sought to extinguish tribal sovereignty, erase reservation boundaries, and sell surplus lands to non-indigenous peoples. The act was amended in 1891, 1906, and 1910 until it included nearly every tribe in the country. The idea behind the Allotment Act was to make the Indian conform to the social and economic structure of rural America by investing him with private property. If it was thought the Indian had his own piece of land, he would forsake his tribal ways and become just like the white homesteaders who were then flooding the unsettled areas of the western United States. Implicit in the ideology behind the law was the idea of the basic sameness of humanity. Just leaving tribal society was, to the originators of the law, comparable to achieving an equal status with whites. But there was more behind the act than the simple desire to help the individual Indian. White settlers had been clamoring for Indian land. If, the argument went, that land was divided on a per capita basis of 160 acres per Indian, the Indians would have enough to farm, and the surplus would be available to white settlement.
An act for the removal of the Winnebago Indians and for the sale of the reservation in Minnesota for their benefit. Such half-breeds and mixed bloods of the Winnebago tribe of Indians as are, in his opinion, sufficiently advanced in civilization and have abandoned or may abandon their tribal relation and permit them to retain and occupy the several tracts of land that have been allotted to them respectively.
The Winnebago tribe from Wisconsin were loaded into railroad cars like cattle. It was cold. Some jumped from the train and returned through the woods and returned to Wisconsin.
Tribal culture was completely disrupted. Communal life destroyed, land taken away again, and outsiders allowed to live on Indian reservations. Congress allowed Indian land to be leased to non-Indians, controlled funds that resulted from leases, and determined when to distribute the funds.
The Indian estate amounted to 136.4 million acres in 1887. By 1920, it had shrunk to 72.7 million acres. of which 17.6 million acres were leased to whites. By 1934, Indians had lost nearly another 90 million acres through land sales, many of them fraudulent.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs took to complete control over your economic, social, and political affairs. Your cultures were the last barrier to colonization, so their foundations were attacked by this act. Hunting and fishing were restricted. Ceremonies like the potlatch, Sundance, and powwow, all vital aspects for life in many indigenous nations, were outlawed. The federal government took control of deciding who was and was not an Indian. You went from being independent indigenous nations with your own governance and structures into impoverished bands. As individuals, you became wards of the state.
Indigenous people couldn't be U.S. citizens when the country ratified its Constitution in 1788 and wouldn't win the right to be for 136 years. When Black Americans won citizenship with the 14th Amendment in 1868, the government specifically interpreted the law so it didn't apply to Indigenous people.
I am not yet prepared to pass a sweeping act of naturalization by which all the Indian savages, wild or tame, belonging to a tribal relation, are to become my fellow citizens and to go to the polls and vote with me. Michigan Senator Jacob Howard, 1866.
In 1924, Congress passed a law that conferred U.S. citizenship on all indigenous peoples.
The Indian Citizenship Act didn't offer full protection of voting rights to Indians. As late as 1948, two states, Arizona and New Mexico, had laws that barred many American Indians from voting, and American Indians faced some of the same barriers as blacks until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, including Jim Crow-like tactics and poll taxes.
1934 to 1953, Indian reorganization era, period of 19 years. Federal Indian policy changed in 1935 as the Indian Reorganization Act, IRA, was enacted to protect the remaining Indian land base, ending the process of allotment on Indian lands in the contiguous United States, and ensuring that all remaining trust allotments would stay in trust indefinitely. The act did not, however, prevent land from passing out of trust when it was inherited by a non-Indian heir, and it did not change some parts of the General Allotment Act that had made the use of allotments increasingly difficult among Indian people. The IRA also encouraged Indian tribes to adopt constitutions and engage in self-government. The IRA was criticized as paternalistic, ethnocentric, and insufficient, a white-imposed reform program.
The IRA was the last great drive to assimilate the American Indian. It was also a program to colonize the tribes. All else had failed to liberate the Indians from the land. Genocide, treaty making and treaty breaking, substandard education, disruption of Indian religion and culture, and the last and most oppressive of such measures, the Dawes Allotment Act. Assimilation into the dominant society, if by assimilation we mean the adoption of certain technologies and techniques, had already been underway for some 100 years. After all, the Indians were not and are not fools. We are always ready to improve our condition, but assimilation, meaning fading into the general society with the complete loss of our identity and our culture, was another thing entirely. And we had fought against this from the first coming of the white man, Rupert Costco, Kauia Nation, 1983.
1953 to 1968, termination era, 15 years. In 1953, the IRA goals were abandoned and federal policy changed yet again. Termination of the federal government's trust relationship with the Indian tribes became the new policy and the goal of assimilation again. Federal benefits and support services were eliminated. In 1953, Public Law 280 gave 6 states criminal jurisdiction over Indian reservations. Relocation in 1956 offered job training and housing assistance to Indians who would leave the reservation for urban areas. Many tribal governments were disbanded and reservations abolished. In Wisconsin, the Menomonie Nation was terminated.
The policy of relocating Native people from the reservations to urban centers was a dismal failure. The program moved people to the city, put them through a quickie training program, got them a cheap apartment, a short-term job, and then left them stranded and lost in the worst parts of town. The policy left Native people socially and culturally disenfranchised, created generations of hardships and broken up families. It also created a subculture of Indian alcoholics for the skid row of major cities such as Oakland, Cincinnati, Chicago, Dallas, and others.
1968 to present, tribal self-determination era, 51 years. In 1968, the present time, federal Indian policy changed to one which promotes tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Since 1968, the legislative and executive branches have attempted to provide measures which would improve the social and economic life of tribes and their people. However, since the 1970s, Indian interests have lost more than 80% of the cases decided by the Supreme Court. In 2011, newly elected Tea Party Senator Paul Rand from Kentucky called for the elimination of the U.S. Department of the Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs and the stripping of almost half of the budget from the Indian Health Service. Time will tell whether the United States will support and promote tribal sovereignty in the years ahead, or will once again actively seek to destroy Indian tribes and take their land. This ends the first part of the blanket exercise. You may step off the blankets and take a seat. The next part of the exercise touches on some of the current issues and concerns of the Indigenous peoples in their own voice.
Native Americans today face some extraordinary challenges by nearly every measure, social, cultural, economic, and physical. Native American communities and Native American families are uniquely and negatively impacted by patterns of struggle. While it is important to be positive and hopeful about the future of life for Native Americans in this country, it is first important to have a genuine understanding of what Indigenous people face collectively and individually. Here are some current facts and definitions. Please take a look at PowerPoint slide 16. Indigenous people today. Pre-European contact, scholarly estimates range from 1.5 million to 20 million Indigenous peoples in North America. From 1890 to 1910, there were fewer than 250,000. In the 2010 census, 5.2 million, 1.7%, people identified as American Indian. Today, there are approximately 2.6 million tribal citizens who belong to 573 federally recognized tribal nations in 37 states.
Survival and historical trauma. The indigenous peoples of this continent have faced 500 years of genocide, dislocation, and variations of physical, mental, and emotional, and spiritual violence. From the biological warfare through the introduction of Western diseases, the dislocation and violence of European expansion across the continent, the cruel and discriminatory policies of the 19th century that banned cultural and spiritual expressions of life and that forcibly remove children from their tribal homes to send them to faraway boarding schools, to the discrimination and ignorance that persists to this day, Native Americans are dealing with generations of collective group trauma. Protect your spirit, so 3 phases of historical trauma. Dominant culture perpetrates mass trauma on a population. Original population response. Initial responses to trauma are conveyed to successive generations. Protect your spirit because you are in the place where spirits get eaten. John Trudell, Lakota poet, activist.
The massive trauma expresses itself today in the form of high rates of addiction, violence, alcoholism, and sexual abuse within Native families and communities. Many accounts suggest that the boarding school generations in particular were permanently scarred by their experience of physical, mental, and sexual abuse in school systems. When these Native children returned to their homes and families, having lost their culture and identity, and began to have families of their own, they were unable to form healthy bonds and pass on these patterns of abuse to their own children, creating cycles of broken families.
Women often turn their anger inward, and at Indian school it was no different. We manifested it by mutilating ourselves, or less often by attacking others. Yet each scar was evidence that we wished to live. We had to keep knives away from one Pueblo student, one of the best painters. We often carried another student to the Indian hospital to have her stomach pumped. She was a stunningly beautiful dancer. We had to hunt down another friend before she froze to death in the snow. She was trying to get home, to a home that was not there. We never really talked about any of this. We did what we could to save each other in the moment. Joy Harwell, Skokie Creek, 1993.
Violence against Native women. In the United States, violence against Indigenous women has reached unprecedented levels on tribal lands and in Alaskan Native villages. More than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced violence, and more than 1 in 2 have experienced sexual violence. Alaska Native women continue to suffer the highest rate of forcible sexual assault and have reported rates of domestic violence up to 10 times higher than in the rest of the United States. Though available data is limited, the number of missing and murdered American Indian and Alaskan Native women, along with the lack of diligent and adequate federal responses, is extremely alarming to Indigenous women, tribal governments, and communities. On some reservations, Indigenous women are murdered at more than 10 times the national average.
Environmental racism refers to the way in which minority group neighborhoods, populated primarily by people of color and members of low socioeconomic groups, are burdened with a disproportionate number of hazards, including toxic waste, toxic waste facilities, garbage dumps, and other sources of environmental pollution and foul odors that lower the quality of life.
Native Americans are unquestionably victims of environmental racism. The Commission of Racial Justice found that about 50% of all American Indians live in communities with uncontrolled hazardous waste sites. Although Native American tribes are sovereign nations, much of their land is held in trust, meaning that the federal government holds title to the land in trust on behalf of the tribe. Some instances of environmental damage arise from this crossover, where the U.S. government's title has meant it acts without approval of the tribal government. Other significant contributors to environmental racism, as experienced by tribes, are forcible removal and burdensome red tape to receive the same reparation benefits afforded to non-Indians. Some recent examples of environmental racism are shown on the screen. The Skull Valley Band of Gushta Indians targeted as a site for high-level nuclear waste dumping ground, amid allegations of payoff as high as $200 million. The tribe has endured decades of uranium contamination. As one tribal activist put it, there's nothing moral about tempting a starving man with money. The Westerns are shown in Yucca mountain area has been purchased by mining companies for its rich uranium stores, a threat that adds to the existing radiation exposure to this area suffers from U.S. and the British nuclear bomb testing. In the Four Corners area, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, a group of Hopi and Navajo families have been forcibly removed from their homes so the land could be mined by the Peabody Mining Company for coal valued at $10 billion. Years of uranium mining on the lands of the Navajo of New Mexico have led to serious health consequences, and reparations have been difficult to secure. In addition to the loss of life, people's homes and other facilities have been contaminated.
Excessive poverty, teenage suicides that outpace all other ethnicities, extreme incidences of type 2 diabetes, unemployment rates that rank among the highest. These are but a few of the contemporary cultural, communal, and individual damages experienced by Indigenous peoples in the U.S. due to the generational impact resulting from the legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. I recall a time when I was young that someone stood among the ferns outside our house and asked me how much Indian I was. He insisted that I couldn't be a full-blood because of the green tint to my brown eyes. He also told me that he had studied Indians a lot in college and had learned that there were hardly any full-bloods left. For some reason, I told him I was half. My uncle heard me. When I went inside, Old Nip asked me which half of me was Indian and which half of me wasn't. I felt foolish. Then he told me to close my eyes and ask my heart what I was. My heart never hesitated. I was Indian. Gabriel Horn, Wampanoag descent.
As Lakota poet and activist John Trudell put it, when Columbus got off the boat, he asked us who we were. We said, we're the human beings, we're the people. They taught us to call ourselves Indians. Now they're teaching us to call ourselves Native Americans. It's not who we are, we're the people. The very fact of calling us Indians creates a new identity for us, an identity that can begin with their arrival. Changing identity, creating a new perceptual reality, is another form of genocide. It's like severing a spiritual umbilical cord that reaches into the ancestral past.
Identity and mascots. In 1863, a Winona, Minnesota newspaper, the Daily Republican, printed an announcement. The state reward for dead Indians has been increased to $200 for every red skin sent to purgatory. This sum is more than the dead bodies of all the Indians east of the Red River are worth. Another story published by the Astesian Daily Champion in Astesian, Kansas, on October 9, 1885, tells of the settlers hunt for redskins with a view of obtaining their scalps, valued at $250.
Identity and colonialization. Colonization works to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their language, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement, and it makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. It makes them want to identify with that which is furthest removed from themselves. It deconstructs the people's sense of self and replaces it with that of the colonizer. Yogiwa Tiango, 1886, or 1986.
Identity and colonization. Decolonization. Decolonization requires non-Indigenous individuals, governments, and institutions and organizations to create the space and support for Indigenous peoples to reclaim all that was taken from them. Decolonization is about Indigenous peoples reclaiming the family, community, culture, language, history, and traditions that were taken from them under the federal government policies designed for assimilation. Indigenous peoples have historically been robbed of our ability to define ourselves, for ourselves, to tell our own stories and from our own lens. We see and experience deeply embedded and harmful stereotypes about us and our ancestors in school curricula, literature, pop culture, Hollywood films, in the savage Indian mascots parading across stadiums, and the hypersexualized Indian maiden Halloween costumes. Americans dehumanizing Native Americans is more American than apple pie. Rendering Indigenous peoples invisible is just as bad. Sarah Sunshine Manning, Shoshone Paiute, recalls the words of her late Uncle John. They can't see us as human beings. We're the evidence of the crime. They can't deal with the reality of who we are, because then they have to deal with the reality of what they have done. If they deal with the reality of who we are, they have to deal with the reality of who they aren't.
Identity and indigenization. Indigenization requires non-Indigenous people to be aware of Indigenous worldviews and to respect those worldviews are equal to other views. Indigenization recognizes the validity of Indigenous worldviews, knowledge, and perspectives, identifies opportunities for indigeneity to be expressed, and incorporates Indigenous ways of knowing and doing.
Sovereignty, the quality or state of having supreme power or authority, supreme and independent power or authority in government as possessed or claimed by a state or community, a sovereign or independent state, community, or political unit. In 1968, the American Indian Movement declared, "We make it unequivocally and crystal clear that Indian people have the right to separate and equal communities within the American system. Our own communities that are institutionally and politically separate, socially equal, and secure within the American system."
For many tribes, sovereignty means the ability to manage their own affairs and exist as a nation that are recognized as having control over their own destinies. It means to live unencumbered by the yoke of an outside power, determining and redetermining their fate. Unfortunately, this has been the nature of relationship between Native American tribes and the United States since the earliest treaties.
For the federal government, U.S. tribal sovereignty means that Native American tribes are domestic dependent nations that exist within the boundaries of the U.S. and that they are wards of the U.S., even though they may operate and manage some internal tribal affairs. From the U.S. viewpoint, tribes do not exist as truly sovereign and independent nations.
Sovereignty and restoration of tribal lands. According to the National Congress of American Indians, self-governance and tribal sovereignty in practice are closely associated with sovereignty over and management of tribal lands. Yet over 90 million acres of tribal land lost through the allotment process, only about 8% that has been reacquired in trust status since the IRA was passed in 1934. Many tribes have no land base, and many tribes have insufficient lands to support housing and self-government. Many tribal lands will not readily support economic development. Many reservations are located far away from the tribe's historical, cultural, and sacred areas, as well as from traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering areas.
The lands of these United States who claim sovereignty over by right of the Doctrine of Discovery are home to more than 500 Indian nations, each with its own distinct culture, religion, language, and history. Yet these Indians and federal Indian law rarely factor into the decisions of the country's governing class, as recent battles over national monuments on tribal sites have been made painfully clear. Sovereignty and the development of tribal lands. The General Allotment Act of 1887 divided lands previously held in common by American Indian tribes into small parcels that were owned by individual tribal members. Designed to encourage self-sufficient farming by Indians, the law allowed tribal members to sell some parcels to whites. Indian owners could also be foreclosed upon if they failed to pay taxes or debts. As a result of the General Allotment Act of 1887, reservation land was divided up and allotted to individual tribal members. When an allottee died, title ownership was divided up among all the heirs. The land itself was not physically divided. Each Indian heir received an undivided interest in the land. Now, as each generation passes on, the number of owners grows exponentially, which has resulted in the highly fractionated ownership of much Indian land today.
According to 2017 estimates on fractionation by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there are 150 reservations with 2.9 million fractional interests owned by approximately 243,000 unique owners. Consent from a majority or supermajority of the parcel's owners is required to use the land for any purpose, leasing for agriculture or natural resources purposes, or business and home site development. With many owners, individual income from the land is minimal, sometimes less than what it costs the federal government to process the payment.
Indian lands that were alienated as a result of the General Allotment Act of 1887 were sold or transferred to non-Indian parties, but remained within reservation boundaries. As a result, trust lands, fee lands, and lands owned by tribes, individual Indians, and non-Indians are mixed on a reservation, creating a checkerboard pattern.
Religious freedom protections. Resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled, that henceforth it shall be the policy of the United States to protect and preserve for American Indians their inherent right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise the traditional religions of the American Indian, Eskimo, Aleut, and Native Hawaiians, including but not limited to access of sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonials and traditional rites. American Indian Religious Freedom Act, 1978.
The Badger II Medicine, a 130,000-acre area within the Lewis and Clark National Forest, and became embroiled in a controversy over potential natural resource development between 1982 and 2017. The Blackfeet tribe argued that these lands were sacred. The tribe ultimately succeeded in stopping development, but only after a 35-year-long fight with the Department of Interior, which initially approved almost 50 oil and gas leases. In 2017, Interior Secretary Jewell canceled the last of these leases. Native American religious freedom continues to be threatened. On December 4, 2017, the Trump administration reduced the Bears Ears National Monument, an area sacred to Native Americans in Utah, by over 1 million acres. Bears Ears Monument is only one example of the conflict over places of religious value. Many other such sacred sites are being viewed as potential areas for development, threatening the free practice of Native Americans' faith.
We could go on, but you need rest. We'll take a 15-minute break, return to this hall after the break. We'll be divided into smaller groups for the talking circles and move to different rooms for that part of the exercise. Thank you.